Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. This is Brendan Kelleher, and in this video I'm going to talk about Rebel Moon Parts 1 and 2, the Snyder Cuts, or the Director's Cuts, or whatever their Netflix are calling them. And I say this as a Zack Snyder fan. I watched Part 1, A Child of Fire, and I did not like it at all. I'm someone who loves his DC movies. I think Man of Steel is one of the best Superman movies ever made. I think Batman v Superman is criminally underrated, particularly in the Ultimate Cut. And Zack Snyder's Justice League, as it's now called, is one of the best superhero movies ever made, if not the best superhero movie ever made. And I was really looking forward to Snyder's Rebel Moon, even the family-friendly cuts as they're going to be known or whatever. I saw Part 1 and I did not like it at all. I mean, like, if you go back and look at my original review of Part 1 of Rebel Moon, I called it Zack Snyder's worst movie. And I still stand by that. I just did not like it at all. I thought it was just dreary looking, it was slow, it was incoherent. I mean, the original movie opened with this Anthony Hopkins narration explain the backstory of the mother world, and it was just too much information thrown at you. And the thing is, they, particularly in the early part of that movie, they really hype up the robot Jimmy, voiced by Anthony Hopkins, as this important character. And after he saves this girl from being raped by these two soldiers, he just disappears until Part 2. And basically, the whole movie came across as a very long version of not just Star Wars, but Battle Beyond the Stars and the Magnificent Seven. The story is essentially the same. You have a small farming community who are being harassed by these thugs who are coming to steal their grain or their food, and they're going to come back, and the hero of the story goes off and finds warriors to fight for them. Go look at Magnificent Seven and its unofficial sci-fi remake Battle Beyond the Stars. They're essentially the same story. The difference is those movies, Magnificent Seven and Battle Beyond the Stars, they tell a very complete story in less than 2 hours. You have the recruiting mission, and then you have our heroes prepare for the battle, and then the final battle happens. Some of them make it, some of them don't, and that's it. Part 1 of Rebel Moon was basically a recruiting mission. They have a fight with the main villain at the end just to have some kind of climax at the end of Part 1. Basically, you could have told the story in 2 hours. I mean, if John Ford could do it, and if John Milius could do it, why can't Zack Snyder? But Zack Snyder has to make everything long. He makes everything long, particularly with all that slow motion. And again, I say that as someone who respects Zack Snyder a lot, because I can't think of any other director, not lately anyway, who has so much respect for his fans. And talking about engagement, I mean, when the Snyder Cut of Justice League came out, he was everywhere. I mean, he was on YouTube, he was on every YouTube channel. When I saw Part 2, it was a slight improvement because it was a more coherent story. It was a more simplified story because all the setup had been done. So basically, if Part 1 was about to set you up for the big fight, Part 2 was the big fight. Now, the first half of Part 2 was basically a lot of slow motion farming, which was a bit tedious, but the final battle was very, very well done, particularly for Netflix production. I mean, I would have liked to have seen this movie on the big screen. All that aside, Zack Snyder and Netflix have been very upfront about the fact that his real, true vision for these movies were going to be on the way. And I was very, very tempted at not watching the original cuts that were going to be presented on Netflix first, because I really want to see Zack Snyder's true vision, because those are always the best versions of his movies. So that brings us to the Snyder cuts, and they're long. They're very, very long. Part 1 clocks in at about 3.5 hours. Part 2 clocks in at 2 hours, 45 minutes or so. People don't just get shot in this version. They get their heads blown off, their bodies are torn apart, there's blood spattering everywhere. And the one improvement I will say with Part 1 is that they show the main villain. You really, really, really hate him after the opening of this movie. He was a piece of shit in the original cut, but he's one of the most evil sons of bitches I've ever seen in this version. There's something he does at the start of this version of the movie. If you find it hard to get through the first 15 minutes of this movie, you will find it very hard to finish this movie. The other thing I have to say at this version of the movie is more coherent. The one thing that threw me off about Part 1 was its exposition. Part 1 opened with this narration by Anthony Hopkins' character, Jimmy. Now, Anthony Hopkins has one of the best voices in film. But like I said earlier, there's just so much information that was thrown at you in the original cut that was just incoherent. The storyline is more simplified and it's easier to follow. And the thing is, the Jimmy character was portrayed as an important character in the original version, And after he kills a few soldiers during that attempted rape scene, he just disappeared. There's obviously a lot more of Jimmy in this version, but still, he doesn't add that much to the story. But it is an improvement, I must say. I mentioned that there was more violence. Not only is there more violence and gore, there's more sex in this version. Much, much more sex. Much more graphic sex than I've seen in a mainstream Hollywood movie for a long, long time. I was beginning to think that sex scenes weren't being allowed in movies anymore, but geez, this movie is very explicit. I mean, there's an explicit sex scene in part 1 and there's an explicit sex scene in part 2. And these scenes go on for at least 5 minutes. We do get to see Sofia Boutella's tits, so that's a bonus. All kidding aside though, as far as the main character, Cora, we do get a lot more backstory for her. Like in the original cuts, we saw her backstory in flashbacks, but in this version, it's much more detailed. We see that she was a child when she was taken by the Imperium, and which we saw in the first version, but in this version, it's more detailed. A funny thing about the slow motion, there's a lot less of it in part 1, and I was thinking to myself, oh, Snyder probably listened to criticism, he held back on the slow motion. I mean, it's still there, but I noticed there was a lot less of it compared to part 2 where there seems to be more of it. As far as part 1 goes, I enjoyed it a lot more than the version that was put out by Netflix originally. It's 3.5 hours long, but I didn't notice that time going. I guess because I was more involved with the characters and there was more world building, it was more interesting. Yeah, particularly the character of Nemesis actually. One of my complaints about the original version was that Nemesis character, the one with the not lightsaber weapons that she had. I mean, there was no backstory for her. They go to her planet and next thing there's a hard cut where they're all in an elevator. We don't even see the scene where they meet her. And she fights this big spider monster, which looks cool, but there's just no context given. Even watching the original cut, I was thinking to myself, oh, this has been completely cut down. Watching the original cut of part 1 was frustrating because, and we should have known this from past experience, but that it was a completely pared down, condensed version of Snyder's original vision, and I just didn't like it at all. But overall, I must say, I really, really enjoyed this version of part 1 a lot more than the original version. Now, let's talk about part 2. As I said earlier, I enjoyed part 2 Rebel Moon, the original version of Rebel Moon. Part 2 was a better movie, in my opinion. If part 1 was a recruiting mission, part 2 was the war story, because all the setup had been taken care of. They established the universe badly, but at least it had been set up. It established that the fight was coming, and all the characters had been gathered, and now part 2 is basically a war movie. Part 2 is still very clumsy in its exposition. Again, Snyder really should have looked more at Magnificent Seven and Battle Beyond the Stars as a template. The reason why movies like Magnificent Seven and Battle Beyond the Stars work is because that you care about the characters. They establish the story, we spend some time with these characters, and by the time the final battle comes, we care about them. And so when certain characters get killed, it has more emotional impact. The problem with part 1 of Rebel Moon was you just didn't really know about these characters. And part 2 tries to address this by having this big drawn out scene where they basically prepare for the big battle to come. And all the main characters sit around the table and they basically have turns explain their backstories. This was kind of drawn out in the original cut. In this version, it's really drawn out. And if that wasn't bad enough, there's lots and lots and lots of wheat farming. I'm pretty sure that Snyder pulled back on the slow motion in his director's cut of part 1. But in part 2, he seems to have saved it all for this version because it just goes on forever. Part 2 is a near 3-hour movie and he spends about 90 minutes setting up for the final fight, even though they should have done that in part 1. There's even scenes where people are farming in super slow motion, and you know what? I like slow motion when it's used well. I mean, Snyder uses it very well in movies like 300, and even in his version of Justice League, the balance between normal motion and slow motion was very well done in the action scenes and certain character scenes. But in this, he just went too far, and I found it was trying my patience at times. At a certain point, all the characters sit around the table and they explain their backstories. And they basically all have the exact same backstory. It's all a variation on, oh, the Empire or the Motherworld came to my planet and destroyed my people and left me an orphan. And then Titus says the same thing. And then the Hawk Boy, I can't remember his name, Turok, says the same thing. They all have this exact same backstory. And this scene goes on for about 20 minutes as they all explain the exact same thing 5 times. Yeah, it was just too much. I mean, he really could have condensed this down and made this more brisk. The first half of part two is a slog to get through. But I will say this, when the final battle comes in part two, it's well worth waiting for. Like in part one, we get more violence, we get more bloodshed, we get more gore and headshots. Lots and lots of headshots. There's more headshots in these two movies than a dozen John Wick films. The final battle in part two, this director's cut, goes on for at least an hour. At least an hour, and that sounds excessive, but it's really intense. Even more than the original cut. The amount of casualties on both sides. I mean, there's a scene where Atticus Noble jumps down into the cavern and he just slaughters a whole bunch of people, men and women. It shows how horrible war really is, you know, and I love that because I'll say it, I like my action movies, I like to see the gore. This is the kind of action that you would never see in a Star Wars movie. I mean, after watching this version of Rebel Moon, Star Wars is not going to look the same. You know, when you look at Star Wars, you see people get shot and they go, they fall down. But the amount of gore and violence in this is unreal. And I loved every minute of it. I thought was very peculiar about the spaceships in the original cuts of Rebel Moon was at least the enemy ship, the main destroyer, seemed to be run on coal. I mean, this is a ship that has faster than light travel. And what was not made clear was how exactly does it go? I mean, you look at the spaceships in Star Wars, they have hyperdrive. Now, clearly the destroyer is capable of faster than light travel, because otherwise it would take forever to get from one system to the next. The way they conveyed this in the original version was that it just had kind of some kind of light speed, but then they show the engineering section and you see workers shoveling what looks like coal into the furnace. And yeah, I was wrong. In this version of Rebel Moon, they really make it clear what is exactly powering those ships, and it's not coal. That's all I'm going to say. The King's Gaze, that's the name of the enemy destroyer in this movie, is powered by some kind of alien being. Like, because in engineering, you see this big, giant, blue-green creature, and they convey that this thing is what powers this ship's faster than light travel, which is unique. It's a very interesting visual, but I wasn't entirely clear on that. But after thinking about it for a while, okay, that's new. And that's the thing about Snyder. He comes up with these concepts which are really cool, and I say this again as a fan, sometimes he just isn't able to convey this in a coherent fashion. He's great at visual storytelling, but not storytelling as such, which is why I think his best movies are when other people write them. Similar to George Lucas in a way. As far as the original cuts of Rebel Moon are concerned, I did not like part 1. I enjoyed part 2 slightly more. With the director's cuts of Rebel Moon, I enjoyed part 1 significantly more than the original version. With part 2, I think it is a lesser version. I think it's just too long. And my overall opinion is that there is a great movie in all these cuts of Rebel Moon. And I think a really talented editor could make a really good 3-hour movie out of Rebel Moon. If you really, really didn't like part 1 and 2 of Rebel Moon, this probably isn't going to change your mind, because whether it's better is up to yourself, but you cannot deny there's just more of everything. There's more slow motion, there's more violence, there's more bad dialogue. Yeah, there's bad dialogue. But the question is, what do you think? Have you seen part 1 and 2 Rebel Moon, the Snyder cut? Let me know in the comments. And if you like content like this, please consider subscribing, like the video, share this video out there, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye for now.